What happens to a star after he or she dies? In the short term, but sometimes longer too, they shine even brighter. As they have no longer the power over their own image, the people will create it for them. Well, maybe not directly the people, but the industry and the owners of the intellectual property. In the end, that means that the profit motive drives the development of the way the star is remembered in the period after the death. Their image and their message gets redefined or extended to better fit the market. They get consumed and refashioned, which means that some aspects of their image needs to be emphasized while others needs to be suppressed. This is the way icons are created, be it a cultural or political icon. It's the same process. For one to become an icon, he or she has to be deracinated, cleaned up and depoliticized for our consumption. Mandela becomes an elderly, affable man instead of a revolutionary. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes an emblem of love across races, forgetting his militant opposition to war and his class-based approach to social change. And those who cannot be cleaned up do not become icons. Certainly, figures like Malcolm X and Castro or Thomas Sankara are not allowed to become such because their names cannot be abstracted from their radical politics. What about this one? Can we turn a ganja-smoking fierce Rasta warrior with revolutionary, pan-African and anti-imperialistic messages into a family-friendly icon which is palatable to a white liberal audience? Seems difficult and actually like a sacrilege to separate Bob Marley from his messages of social critique, but that's what happened. The capitalist machine pacified him and turned the rebel into a saint. Bob Marley advocated revolution. He urged poor people to stand up for their rights, yet that's surely not what the conservative and established powers want, so they claim him as an icon of saintly and eternal poverty. Even though this refashioning of Bob's image was successful and assured his immortality, he is now one of the most misunderstood figures in modern culture. And with the upcoming new movie about him, I'm curious what image they will show. Will it be closer to his roots, closer to the truth, or will it just be another step into complete romanticization, a glossy image only serving the further commercialization of Bob Marley's image, making him an accomplice of the same capitalist and exploitative system he denounced? Bob Marley's life tells us a story of determination, incredible skills and talents, a bit of luck, and most of all a mission. The last one is what probably separates Bob from other popular music stars the most. His sense of mission, an intense drive to make music, and in doing so tell the truth about the world. And he knew a few things about the world because of where he came from. Robert Nesta Marley was born on the 6th February 1945 as the son of a devoted black mother and an absent white father on a British colonial island in the Caribbean, Jamaica. And as we can't tell Bob Marley's story without the story of Jamaica, that's where we start. At the time of Bob's birth, Jamaica has already been under colonial control for over 450 years, first by the Spanish crown after Columbus landed on the island, and from 1655 by the British. The native inhabitants of Jamaica, the Arawak and Carib, have already long been eliminated. The British then imported in their place African slaves to work in the plantations. In short, Jamaica's history is a story of genocide and slavery, but also the fight against that. Bob Marley's generation grows up with literature about slavery and the resistance. Especially the escaped slaves, the Maroons were a symbol of anti-colonial resistance within a repressive system. The old colonial system favored, of course, white people and used brown or mixed-race people as a buffer zone to the poor black peasantry. Even though Bob was light-skinned, because he was mixed race, he still grew up without any privileges, first in 9 Miles in a black peasant family, then in the urban ghetto of the capital Kingston. His father, Norval Marley, who was already around 50 when Bob was born, left the 18-year-old Cedella alone with the newborn, so Bob had no connections to the mixed-race bourgeoisie of the island. Race consciousness always played a part in Jamaican history, but it was the rise of Marcus Garvey and his movement that this was actually articulated. Garvey was a Pan-Africanist. He advocated not only the liberation of Africa from colonial rule, but also the repatriation of the descendants of enslaved Africans in the New World to their homeland. These messages were to become a huge part of Rastafarianism and will be part of the upcoming music of conscious reggae. When Bob was a child, he grew up in a Jamaica that was in the middle of a transformation. After the rebellion of 1938, the island was slowly entering Third World modernity and was on the way to post-colonial autonomy. In the end of the 50s, Bob was living with his mom in Trench Town, where he worked in a welding workshop, and he was already making music with his friend Bunny Livingstone. Then Peter Tosh joined them. The trio that was to be called the Wailers was trained by Joe Higgs, a Rastafarian. This was something special in that time. The Rasta religion was still very young, not even 30 years old, but it became increasingly visible and louder in the 60s as a self-confident social movement amongst the poorest layers of the black working class. The Rastas broke fundamentally with Christianity. Nevertheless, they used the citation of the Bible. The reading, though, was centered around Africa that was believed to be Zion, the holy land to which the in the diaspora living African descendants would return when their Messiah arrives. Yes, here we find again Marcus Garvey and this Back to Africa messages. This repatriation motif became, although less literal than metaphorical. Africa signified the epoch of black liberation to come. As in most religions, we also find here this duality of good and evil. The latter was here represented by what was called Babylon. Babylon is identified with whiteness, the European doctrine of white superiority, and the exploitative class system. So after hundreds of years of oppression and racial injustice, there was a new movement that affirmed blackness and the autonomy and self-respect of the masses. In 1962, after Bob left the welding shop and his mom moved to Delaware, Bob started writing songs and went to a producer. As he wasn't successful with that, he ended up on the streets. Nevertheless, that setback didn't discourage him. He still pushed the Wailers, and he became more and more the leader of the group. The Jamaican music scene was at that time a special place to be. There was new music created all the time and a high rate of innovation and experimentation happening. Kingston was like a giant laboratory of music, where R&B, mambo, meringue, mento calypso, ska and rocksteady were mixed and reinvented. In this big musical melting pot, the Wailers now made their debut at Studio One, and they had their first dancehall hit with Simmer Down. After that success, Bob was off the streets, and the producer allowed him to sleep in a shed at the back of the studio. The Wailers produced one hit after the other in that time. However, Bob became more and more demanding and pushy. After he tried to beat up one of his competitors, he was given the nickname Tough Gong, later the name of his own record label. Bob also renamed the group to Bob Marley and the Wailers in that period. In 1965, Bob met Rita Anderson when her group, the Solettes, auditioned in Studio One, and they fell in love. One day after their marriage in February 1966, Bob moved to his mom to Delaware, where he stayed for 9 months, working at a Chrysler car plant and then in a hotel. He saved some money there, enough to buy an electric guitar and to return to Jamaica. Back in Kingston, he started making music again with Peter and Bunny, but while he was gone, the style of the Wailers changed. They made a shift from the faster ska to a slower rocksteady according to the motto, "The people are getting old, cut down the tempo." In 1967, Rita and Bob had their first child, a son called Ziggy. Now began the time of Bob's politicization, when he was drawing on Rastafari and traditional black Jamaican culture. The music of Bob Marley and the Wailers became explicitly more political, which was to be called conscious reggae. Already Simmer Down was a striking piece of social reportage, but the songs Hooligan, Rude Boy and Jailhouse went a stage further. They empathized with the working class youth and the resistance to the strong-arm tactics of the police. Fire Fire was also a ferocious attack on Babylon. Peter Tosh says, "Could you kindly reduce the temperature on this earth? It's too hot down here." These lyrics are an example of Bob's attempt to bring Africa and Rastafari into his music. An important part of Rasta is smoking Ganya. In many songs you can hear that they were written and probably sung while consuming it. Best example is probably Sun is Shining from 1970. Then, after 6 years of struggle, especially in the alliance with Johnny Nash, Destiny hit in 1972. After a tour with Nash, the penniless Bob and the Wailers were left stranded in London. Bob then went to Chris Blackwell at Island Records as a last resort. Blackwell just lost Jimmy Cliff, and as he was fan of this kind of natural reggae, he was immediately interested in Bob and the Wailers. Blackwell had a sure ear for talent, and he was a brilliant rock entrepreneur. Even though Bob actually wanted to be a soul and not a rock singer, this was the turn they made for the band to finally take off. Blackwell started with the rockification of the group, and the success of this shows that reggae really can be rock. We can see that, for example, in the song Concrete Jungle. 2 albums were now produced, Catch a Fire, which was much more rock, and Burnin', which was more reggae. From then on, Bob became famous, and he should live his last 8 years as an international rock star. With the release of Rastaman Vibration in 1976, the major world market of the USA finally opened up. The majority of Bob's writing in the later years dealt with questions of social justice. He carried on attacking social and racial inequality right to the end. However, some of his behaviors seemed contradictory to these ideals of emancipation and liberation. For example, his sexism and promiscuity. From 1973 onwards, Bob lived and worked in Blackwell's mansion in uptown Kingston. Hope Road became a strange amalgam of Rasta community, rock star hideout, and football training camp. Many different kind of people visited him there. Bob had a pick of the female fans and admirers. He had multiple affairs with women that also had children from him. At the same time, his wife Rita lived with the children at a little house at Bull Bay along the coast of Kingston. The contrast between Bob's radical politics and music and his patriarchal behavior was sharp indeed. Another contradiction is probably that in 1974, with Blackwell's encouragement, Bob effectively sacked Peter and Bunny. The group, which had been together through 11 years of struggle, but also prolific creativity, came suddenly apart. Bob then assembled other musicians and background singers, among them also his wife Rita. Bob Marley went on a very successful tour with this new setup. When he came back to Kingston, the Jamaican economy was about to collapse. At the same time as he became a multimillionaire, his country was in great distress. How did that happen? The PNP government of Michael Manley tried to save the Jamaican economy from the failures of his predecessor. Hugh Shearer of the JLP presided over an inefficient and corrupt regime whose economic policy had led to massive dependency on US capital. In effect, the direct colonial control by Britain had been replaced during the 60s and early 70s by the economic control on the part of American corporations. After that, Michael Manley started to implement a social agenda called democratic socialism to secure Jamaica's economy without taking from the working class. The main planks of this policy were a mixed economy involving limited state ownership of bauxite extraction as well as banking. Also, jobs were to be created in order to eliminate unemployment, and the education sector was to be transformed to fight illiteracy. The bauxite levy generated an instant and large-scale revenue stream, but also strong opposition from international capitalism, expressed by the US. Manley introduced price and rent controls, and he announced an even more socialist agenda in his next election campaign. Then the 1973 oil price crisis hit Jamaica, just when it was about to get stable again. Now inflation came to the island and chaos spread. Gangs were by now controlling the streets of Kingston. So when Bob was back in Kingston, he kinda ended up involuntarily in the crossfire between the rivaling parties, PNP and JLP. When Bob announced his outdoor concert, Smile Jamaica, for the 5th of December 1976, and Manley announced the elections right after that event, it looked as if Bob was in support of the PNP. Bob then received threatening calls telling him to cancel the concert. Rita would later say that she assumed these calls came from the JLP people. On the 3rd of December, gunmen then burst into Bob's home and shot him, Rita and his manager Don Taylor. Fortunately, the shoots weren't fatal, and even though they were wearing bandages, Rita and Bob went to play the Smile Jamaica concert. Nevertheless, Bob was traumatized by this invasion, and so he took off to London for 14 months to record his next 2 albums, Exodus and Kaya. In the meantime, Manley beat his JLP competitor, but his socialist agenda couldn't save the country. When the IMF demanded a set of monetarist measures in order to grant financial support, the experiment of democratic socialism was stopped. Bob came back from London to Kingston in 1978 and was greeted at the airport by 2,000 people. To celebrate that the gangs in the ghettos have come to an agreement, Bob wanted to give a peace concert. The famous One Love concert took place on the 22nd April. At the climax, as the Wailers were playing Jamming, Bob called out to Manley and JPL Seeger in the audience. After the men climbed up on the stage, Bob clasped their hands together, an iconic gesture for the times. Unfortunately, One Love was followed by renewed political violence, and within 18 months the bloody ousting of the PNP government took place. As the CIA already had its hand in a multitude of assassinations and overthrowings in South America in the past, some believe they also supported here in Jamaica the end of the socialist experiment. JLP and Seeger came to power and established a new neoliberal order in the post-colony. In the meantime, Bob was diagnosed with cancer on his toe. He was highly suspicious of the Babylon medical practice, so he refused the classical treatment and turned to natural remedies. In 1979, Bob and the Wailers produced their album Black Survival, which was the most militant attack on the Babylon system Bob would produce. Even though there are plenty of Rasta references, the album as a whole has a Pan-African theme which was strikingly secular and contemporary in his focus. Before the release, the label changed the name from Black Survival to Survival in order to appeal to the mainstream white market. After giving 2 concerts in Zimbabwe to celebrate independence, Bob was not well. He tried an unconventional cancer therapy in the Bavarian Alps, which was not successful. Bob was rushed home to Jamaica. However, on the way back, he died in Miami on the 11th May 1981. His last words that he spoke to his son Ziggy were, "On your way up, take me up. On your way down, don't let me down." Bob's body rests in 9 Miles, next to the cabin where he lived with his mom. Bob's head was placed so that he can look east towards the rising sun. And now we come back to the beginning. After Bob Marley's death, he was claimed immediately by every side to support their political, ideological, or profit-driven agenda. Island Records released the Legend album, a retrospective compilation in 1984. On the cover we see a smiling Bob, very family-friendly. They avoided to use the word reggae in the title, and only a few songs on the album can be said to be songs of social critique. Ironically, it is exactly this album that has been Bob's most successful one in the marketplace. When we think about Bob's lyrics, we refuse to be the people you wanted us to be. It has a bitter taste, understanding that at the exact moment that he couldn't agree or disagree anymore, the industry turned him into something they wanted him to be.
Have you made a lot of money out of your music?
Money? I mean, how much is a lot of money to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Have you made, say, millions of dollars?
No.
Are you a rich man?
When you mean rich, what you mean?
Do you have a lot of possessions? A lot of money in the bank?
Position make you rich? I don't have that type of richness. My richness is life, forever.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like or write your favorite Bob Marley song or quote in the comments.